Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this video will give you a little primer on magical realism as we discuss the historical context of Reeling for the Empire by Karen Russell. So let me go ahead and share my screen as we discuss this important genre. Okay, so magical realism it's sort of a very complex idea. There is no unified definition of magical realism, but we can start out by thinking that it actually is a subgenre of realism, a genre that came about in reaction to Romanticism, particularly in American literature around the turn of the 20th century, and continues to be a very dominant genre in American literature. But magical realism sort of adds to that idea of realism. That was made popular, particularly by Latin American writers such as Borges and Marquez. We have read a story that definitely falls into the magical realism category. You'll remember it by Marquez as a very old man with enormous wings, right? And so we can see that, some ideas of what magical realism might contain by looking at that story. So again, the genre itself is the definitions are rather fluid. It also depends on, what country might be generating that magical realism, but we can see that it blurs the lines between realism and this idea of fantasy. Okay, so what is realism then? Realism is a genre that reacts to the Romanticism that we talked about earlier in the semester. It is a genre that often contains stories about, the mundane, the day-to-day life. It is generally not about your upper classes, but more about your middle, working, and lower economic classes. They are meant to describe life as it is, right? Rather than, fit it into some sort of romantic story or romantic ideal, but, sort of present life as it is, and focusing on maybe human suffering, and the challenges that humans have to face in reality, right? Um, and they're often sort of gritty. They may or may not have happy endings, and they're definitely fictionalized stories. Magical realism, then, what's interesting about that is that it infuses into it some sort of what we might consider magical or fantastical element. But it's not a fantasy. It's just like this. We have to kind of go into that world going like, oh, well, yes, of course, we have people with wings in this society. It's not surprising to us that we would see an old man with wings. It's not surprising to us that we would see, women turning into silkworms. Like, of course that happens, right? It's not to take it to some sort of fantasy world, but it's infused into a real world, and it is attempts to normalize it. Right now, why would they do that? Well, one of the ideas to do that is by infusing this sort of magical element into the normal world. Right, it sort of disrupts the way that we look at the normal world. Right, it's kind of intended to expand our perceptions of what can be real. And so by disrupting that, it opens up possibilities and perspectives, to rethink the way that we live and we exist in this world. It also can suggest that if we take the time, right, and look at elements in the real world, that we might actually see the magic that already exists in the world that we live in today. Right? I mean, we know that all the time. We can, look at the sky, we can look at nature, we can look at human kindness, we can look at things, and if we just sit back and open up our perspective, right, that we can see like those things as somehow magical, right? Or fantastical or marvelous. Um, and often magical realism in its way of disrupting the way that we look at the world, it often offers a critique of society or societal institutions such as religion or politics or within um, human activities such as compassion or cruelty or things like that, right? So it disrupts the way that we look at the real world, um, and there are extensions of that disruption that magical realism allows us to pursue. Let's make a shift now to talking about the context of Reeling for the Empire by Karen Russell. And then we'll kind of bring the two together at the end of this video, right? So you probably have heard of the samurai and the shogunate. And listen, I'm not a Japanese historian. And so this is going to be a pure, sort of broad strokes look at the historical context to set us up for the story. Certainly, if you took a Japanese history class, or if you are familiar with Japanese history, you're going to be able to provide a lot more detail than what I can provide in this short video. But essentially, in the 19th century, there was this disruption in the political system and the economic system in Japan, which prior to this moment was largely a feudal system with lords known as the shoguns or the shogunate, sort of managing what we might think of as different, feudal or tribal systems, although tribal is not quite the right word, but you understand what I'm saying. And the samurai were their warrior groups that would help defend themselves. And sometimes they would fight amongst each other. But generally, it was an organized system. But what it did, it is argued that it did not allow them to, first of all, progress in the way that the Western world was progressing, and in that sense of industrial technology and whatnot. And it also left them vulnerable to Western invasion, right? Western conquest, Western manipulation. And so essentially what happened is there was this struggle, and eventually we saw the loss of the feudal system and a return to an imperial system with the leader of Emperor Meiji. And with that ended the shogun system, ended the samurais, and began a centralized government, right, that would allow, they believed, not only for a great progression in modernization, but the ability to better defend themselves against Western threats, or other threats as well, but particularly Western threats. So under Emperor Meiji, there was this push to modernize or Westernize, and it happened really fast. I mean, some say it happened in as short as 40 years. And this push to modernize radically changed Japan's political, social, and economic systems, as well as it's changed its relationship with the West and America in particular. Also discussed in this story is the silk trade, and the silk trade was essentially an Asian trade with the West. It was primarily done through China and Japan. They were the major exporters of silk. And for one big reason is that silkworms in Europe had come down with a disease that turned out to be contagious, and it was kind of, destroying the worms and the silk industry. So this gave Japan and China a leg up in exporting silk. Their worms apparently were okay. And so what happened with the Meiji Restoration period is that they were able to recruit, if you will, the massive labor that it took to produce the great amount of silk that they were exporting. And so by the end of the 19th century, these little islands of Japan were able to far exceed, right, even China as an exporter of silk. It became a major export and revenue generator for Japan, as well as open up trade with the West in important ways. How did they recruit this massive labor that they needed in order to generate that much silk? Well, what they did was they were promoting this idea of Japanese nationalism, this loyalty to Japan, this loyalty to the emperor. And in so doing, they went to rural areas that were, farms and whatnot. And the idea was that the industry that had moved into farming had freed up, if you will, some of the family members, particularly daughters who would have normally been working on the farm, no longer needed to do that because they had new technologies. And so they went to recruit these daughters from these rural areas to meet these needs. The daughters were, generally not all of that educated. And truthfully, it seems that, the farmers and the people in these rural areas were not quick to want to give their daughters away to go and work in these silk factories. But there was this great nationalist propaganda movement that went through, and they said, listen, even the government officials are sending their daughters because this is for the good of Japan. And that didn't turn out to actually be true. There were some local government officials that sent their daughters off, but it wasn't true that certainly the high officials were sending their daughters off to work in these factories. But they did sort of bribe the families, in addition to building up this loyalty to, the greatness of Japan, by giving them what they called an advance. Turns out that maybe this wasn't really that much of an advance, but a loan. But this would allow the families of these daughters to pay their rent, to pay off their farms, to do what they needed to do in these, struggling transitional economic times for them. And so they would send out their daughters to go work in these massive factories where the daughters were very poorly paid, and essentially were, indentured servants to the silk factories. And, their conditions were so bad, and so restricted and so oppressive that they actually were heavily guarded. So they would not try to escape. And if they did escape, they usually were rapidly caught and returned to the factories. So bringing all these ideas together then and taking a look at the story, we see that the story focuses on a young woman, Kitsune, and her day-to-day life in the silk factory. We get a little backstory from her. We find that she, unlike the other girls, had actually chosen to go to the factory. Yes, to help with her family, but she actually forged her father's name and drank the tea with the idea that she was making a choice to do this, that she was empowered, and she felt empowered, right, in making this choice for herself. It's clear that she did not uh, know fully the consequences of her choice, but we see her as a woman, as a young girl who's making choices in her life to empower herself, as well as take care of her family, at least her father. She drinks this tea, and as we know, the tea is the magical, sort of elixir that causes her to begin to turn into this cross between, a human and a worm, thereby making the reeling of silk, the spinning of silk, much more efficient. Of course, that happens. So, everybody knows that if you drink a tea, you can turn into a worm and spin silk. That's just normal, right? And so we see that magical realism coming into this story. She was not surprised when she showed up to see other girls that were turning into worms, and the girls that later showed up, right, were not surprised to see the girls turning into worms. Like, of course, this happens, right? It happens. No big deal. But we began to see this idea, of course, like, so what is monstrous? What is human? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a monster, right? And who is the monster, right? Is it the girls that are turning into worms? Is it the person who's guarding them? Is it the person who's recruiting them? Is it the larger social system, right? These are questions that we begin to ask by infusing this idea of, the monster, the creature, if you will, into the story. Themes in the story, of course, include this idea of transformation. Naturally, this is exactly what was going on in the Japanese economic system, right? It was transforming into something else. The government system was transforming into something else. But what we also see here is this sort of theme of empowerment within an oppressive system, right? It's almost kind of like perhaps this element of hope, or maybe not, right? Maybe if we pull back and we go, like, listen, we can't turn into worms, and we can't, once we are oppressed, that we can't turn ourselves into cocoons and moths that fly away, right? But perhaps that's metaphorical for, a symbol of hope, right? That you can, even within the most oppressive systems, find avenues of self-empowerment. I leave that to you to define whether or not you think this story has a hopeful ending, right? Is Kitsune going to have, a better life as a result of her finding a way to cocoon herself? But what we do see is that this link from her ability to make a choice in the beginning, right, where she maybe was going from, sort of an oppressive system to another oppressive system, but that she has that sort of ability to make choices for herself rather than to just comply with whatever it is that she's supposed to be doing. We don't know what's going to happen to her, but we do see that she has made steps, right, to empower herself, that somehow the moth for her is something better than being the worm. This story, of course, is describing, a situation within the Meiji regime in the 19th century, but this story was not published until, the 21st century, like 2012, 2013. And it was published by an American writer long after the Meiji Restoration. So one has to wonder, right, when we think about this story, especially within the context of magical realism, yes, it's highlighting perhaps an oppressive system that whose industry and trade and modernization was perhaps done on the backs of these young girls. But I wonder if, given that this story comes out in 2012, Do you think that it is highlighting, or critiquing, you know, some sort of political system or economic system or business system, um, or social system within the 21st century, within even maybe America, uh, or maybe globally, right? And so this is what magical realism does for us, right? It brings us into a story and highlights something and infuses magic into it, forcing us to ask these kinds of questions about oppression, about transformation, about what it means to be monstrous, um, but also then pulling back a little bit metaphorically and saying, okay, how is this affecting the world that I live in today, right? Are there lessons? Are there themes that we can extract by looking at this story through this magical realism lens and then transfer it to thoughts about how we are living today in our day-to-day mundane lives? Okay, so I hope that you have found this video useful. I hope it helps you enjoy the story and begin to have a little bit of understanding of magical realism as we go forward in the class. Okay, have a great day.